The morning began like any other at the hospital, with long corridors filled with steady footsteps, distant alarms, and the quiet urgency that never really disappeared from the place. The nurse arrived a little earlier than her shift, as she often did, because she liked having a few minutes to prepare herself before the day became unpredictable. She changed into her uniform, tied her hair back neatly, and stood for a moment near the mirror in the staff room, taking a slow breath. There was nothing unusual in the air that morning, nothing that suggested the day would end differently from all the others she had worked before. She checked her small notebook, reviewed the assignments she expected to handle, and stepped out into the ward with calm focus. From the very beginning of her shift, she moved with quiet confidence. Patients came and went, monitors beeped steadily, and doctors gave instructions that needed quick responses. She followed every task carefully, making sure each patient was comfortable and stable. There was a natural rhythm in her work, something that had developed over years of experience. Even in stressful moments, she rarely showed panic. Instead, she would pause, assess, and act in a way that kept situations under control. Some of the newer staff often observed her from a distance, noticing how she handled pressure without raising her voice or losing her calm. It was not loud skill but steady skill, the kind that built trust over time. Still, not everything around her felt smooth. There had been small changes in the atmosphere over the past weeks. A few colleagues spoke less to her than before. Some instructions from senior staff felt colder, more direct than usual. She noticed these shifts but chose not to react. She told herself that hospitals were busy places and people often carried stress that had nothing to do with her. She focused instead on her responsibilities. If a patient needed help, she helped. If paperwork needed attention, she completed it. If someone asked for assistance, she responded without hesitation. That was how she had always worked, and she believed consistency would speak for itself. By midday, the ward became more active. A sudden influx of patients filled the available beds, and the staff moved quickly to manage the situation. The nurse was assigned to a section that required close monitoring, and she stayed there for several hours without rest. She adjusted medication schedules, checked vital signs repeatedly, and reassured anxious patients who were struggling to understand their conditions. At one point, she stayed beside an elderly patient who was frightened by the noise and confusion around them. She spoke softly, explaining each step of care in simple words until the patient finally relaxed. Moments like that reminded her why she chose this profession, even when it became exhausting. However, not everyone seemed to notice her effort in the same way. Near the afternoon, she was called aside briefly by a senior supervisor. The tone of the conversation was different from what she expected. It was not direct anger, but something colder, more formal. She was told that there had been discussions about her role and performance within the team. The words were unclear, wrapped in vague explanations about restructuring and team adjustments. She tried to ask questions, trying to understand what exactly was being decided, but the answers remained indirect. The conversation ended with her being told to wait for further instruction. She returned to her duties with a quiet sense of unease, though she still continued working as before. As the day moved closer to evening, the hospital began to slow slightly, though the tension never fully disappeared. The nurse completed her assigned tasks and prepared reports for the shift change. She checked on her last set of patients, making sure everything was stable before she handed over responsibilities. A few colleagues avoided eye contact when she spoke to them, which she found unusual but chose not to dwell on. Instead, she focused on finishing her work properly, just as she always did. When her shift officially ended, she gathered her belongings slowly, expecting the usual routine of signing out and leaving through the staff exit. But instead of a normal departure, she was asked to come to a small office near the administration section. The request felt serious, and something in her stomach tightened as she walked there. Inside the room, a few senior staff members were present. The atmosphere was heavy, almost silent. She stood near the door for a moment, waiting for instructions. Then she was told, in careful and formal language, that her services were no longer required at the facility. The explanation was brief, filled with general statements about changes in staffing needs and departmental decisions. There were no clear reasons tied to her actual work that day. For a moment, she did not fully react. It felt as if her mind needed time to process what had just been said. She asked again, calmly, if there was any specific issue she should know about. The response remained the same, vague and final. There was no argument from her side, no raised voice. Instead, a quiet silence filled the room. She simply nodded, holding back emotions that had started to rise. She was given a few instructions about collecting her remaining items and completing exit procedures. The meeting ended quickly, almost abruptly, as if it had been prepared long before she entered. When she stepped out of the office, the hospital felt different. The same corridors she had walked through countless times now seemed unfamiliar. People continued working, speaking, and moving as usual, but she felt slightly separated from it all, as if she no longer belonged to the rhythm she had been part of just hours earlier. She went to the staff room, packed her belongings slowly, and removed her identification badge. Holding it in her hand for a moment, she looked at it without speaking. It represented years of routine, effort, and responsibility, yet now it felt strangely distant. She left the hospital through the side exit to avoid attention. The evening air outside was cooler than expected, carrying a soft breeze that brushed against her face. For a moment, she stood still near the entrance, unsure of what to do next. People passed by on the street, some in groups, some alone, all moving toward their own destinations. She started walking slowly without a clear direction, simply following the path in front of her. Each step felt lighter and heavier at the same time, as if her thoughts were moving faster than her body. As she walked, memories of the day replayed in her mind. The patients she had helped, the conversations she had shared, the sudden meeting, the final words. Nothing fully made sense yet. She tried to convince herself that there must be a reason, that misunderstandings sometimes happened in workplaces under pressure. But uncertainty stayed with her, growing quietly as she moved farther away from the hospital building. The lights behind her slowly faded into the distance, while the road ahead became longer and quieter. She continued walking without rushing, holding her small bag close, lost in thought. The world around her felt normal, but her own world had shifted in a way she could not yet explain. And as the evening deepened, she had no idea that the events set in motion that day were far from over. Earlier that same day, before anything had gone wrong, the hospital had felt like a place full of routine and controlled chaos. The nurse had arrived with the same quiet discipline she always carried, not expecting anything unusual. She had walked through the entrance, greeted the security desk with a simple nod, and moved straight toward the changing area without stopping to chat. Her mind had already shifted into work mode, as it always did the moment she stepped inside the building. There was comfort in that routine for her, even if the world around her often changed without warning. She had been assigned to a busy medical ward that morning, one that rarely stayed quiet for long. Patients came in with different conditions, some stable and some requiring immediate attention. The nurse had quickly reviewed the list of cases and started prioritizing them without hesitation. It was not something she needed to think deeply about anymore. Years of experience had trained her to read situations quickly and respond in the right order. She moved from one bed to another, checking monitors, adjusting small details, and speaking gently to patients who were anxious or confused. One of the early cases that morning had been a middle-aged patient struggling with breathing difficulties. The situation had looked unstable at first glance, and the surrounding staff had briefly shown concern. The nurse had approached calmly, asked a few questions, and checked the readings on the monitor. Instead of panicking or calling for unnecessary escalation, she had adjusted the oxygen level within safe protocol limits and repositioned the patient to improve airflow. Her actions had been careful, not rushed, and within a few minutes the patient's condition had started to stabilize. A junior staff member had watched quietly from a distance, surprised at how smoothly she had handled it without calling for extra help. However, not everyone interpreted her decisions the same way. A senior staff member who arrived later had glanced at the chart and frowned slightly. There was a brief moment of silence before a question was asked about why adjustments had been made without prior approval. The nurse had explained her reasoning clearly, referencing the patient's condition and standard emergency response guidelines. The explanation had been correct, but the tone in the room had already shifted. Instead of open discussion, there had been a sense of quiet disagreement, as if her judgment was being measured more critically than before. She had noticed this change in atmosphere but chose not to dwell on it. She continued with her responsibilities, moving through the ward as new patients arrived. Still, small moments like that began to add up throughout the day. Instructions were sometimes repeated to her in a more formal tone than necessary. Simple decisions she made were occasionally double-checked by others, even when time was limited. It was subtle, not openly hostile, but noticeable enough for someone who worked closely with the same team every day. During a later emergency call, the tension became slightly more visible. A patient had been brought in requiring immediate stabilization. The room had filled quickly with staff, each person taking positions according to protocol. The nurse had stepped in as she always did, focusing on what needed to be done rather than the noise around her. She assisted with equipment setup, monitored vital signs, and relayed updates in a steady voice. In moments like this, there was no time for hesitation or confusion. At one point, she had suggested a specific adjustment based on the patient's response, something that had previously worked in similar situations. She had not acted outside protocol, but her decision had been made quickly, based on observation. The patient's condition improved slightly afterward, but not everyone had agreed with the timing of her intervention. A brief discussion followed between staff members once the situation stabilized, with questions raised about whether her step had been necessary at that exact moment or if it had created unnecessary deviation from standard procedure. She had defended her actions calmly again, explaining her reasoning without raising her voice. But she could feel the shift becoming more solid now, like something was forming behind closed doors. It was not about a single decision anymore. It was about perception. And perception, she knew, could sometimes matter more than results in environments like this. By midday, she had already handled more cases than usual. Fatigue was starting to build, though she rarely showed it. She drank water quickly between tasks, reviewed notes carefully, and kept moving. During a short break, she sat alone in the staff area, quietly going over patient charts in her mind. That was when she first noticed that a few colleagues had stopped speaking as openly around her. Conversations would pause slightly when she entered a room, then resume in lower tones. It was small, but noticeable enough to make her think something had changed. She tried not to assume the worst. Hospitals were stressful environments, and misunderstandings were common. Still, she could not ignore the growing sense that her actions were being viewed differently than before. Earlier in her career, she had always been praised for her ability to remain calm and decisive. Now, those same qualities seemed to be viewed through a more critical lens, as if confidence had turned into something questionable. Later in the afternoon, she was asked to review a set of updated guidelines that had recently been circulated. She read them carefully, comparing them with the methods she had used during the morning cases. To her, there was no contradiction. Her actions had aligned with emergency procedures, even if interpreted differently by others. Still, she made a note to clarify certain points later if needed, because she valued working in harmony with the team. But before she could do that, she was called away briefly by a supervisor. The conversation was short, but the tone was serious. She was asked about her earlier decisions, specifically the adjustments made during the breathing emergency case. She explained everything again, slowly and clearly, just as she had done before. The supervisor listened without interrupting much, then made a note without giving any clear reaction. There was no confirmation, no reassurance, only silence after her explanation. When she returned to her duties, she felt a slight heaviness in her thoughts, though she pushed it aside. She focused on the patients again, continuing her work with the same dedication. But something had shifted now, even if she could not fully define it. It was not one event, but many small ones layered together throughout the day. The way people looked at her, the way questions were asked, the way silence lingered a little longer than before. By the time her shift was nearing its end, she had already begun preparing mentally to leave. She believed that once the day was over, things would return to normal clarity. Misunderstandings, if there were any, could be resolved later through proper discussion. That was her mindset. She trusted systems, procedures, and communication. She did not expect sudden conclusions without explanation. What she did not know was that, while she continued working calmly through her tasks, quiet discussions were already taking place elsewhere in the hospital. Conversations that she was not part of. Interpretations of her decisions that were being shaped without her presence. A picture of the day was being formed from fragments, not from full understanding. And in that process, her role in the hospital was already being questioned in ways she had not yet been told. As the evening approached, she finished her duties unaware that decisions were slowly moving beyond her reach. She still believed she would leave the hospital as she always had, through the same routine exit, carrying nothing more than the fatigue of a long shift. But behind the calm surface of the day, something irreversible had already begun to take shape, waiting for the moment it would reach her directly. She had already left the hospital building, but inside the system, the day was not finished yet. The shift change had created a brief overlap of activity where one group of staff handed over responsibilities to another. Charts were updated, patients were reassigned, and the usual noise of the evening routine filled the corridors. For a short time, everything seemed normal again, as if the earlier tension had been nothing more than a passing cloud. But that sense of routine did not last long. A call came in from a nearby medical facility within the same regional network. It started as a standard emergency alert, the kind that hospitals receive from time to time. At first, it did not seem unusual. However, within minutes, the tone of communication changed. The situation was not stable, and the patient involved required immediate specialized care that was not easily available on short notice. The staff at the receiving facility quickly began standard procedures. A team was assembled, equipment was prepared, and the patient was assessed as quickly as possible. But almost immediately, a problem became clear. The case was complex, more complicated than initial reports had suggested. It was not just a matter of routine treatment. It required someone with specific hands-on experience in handling sudden respiratory failure cases combined with rapid stabilization techniques under limited response time. As discussions continued between doctors and coordinators, one name began to appear repeatedly in conversation. It was not a formal recommendation at first, but rather something mentioned by those who had worked with her before. They recalled how she had handled similar situations with calm precision earlier in the day at the other hospital. Even though she was no longer on duty there, her actions had left a strong impression on those who had witnessed them. At the same time, no one immediately realized that she had already been officially removed from her position just hours earlier. The communication about her status had not yet reached all departments. Information moved slowly through administrative channels, and in urgent situations, people often relied on memory and experience rather than formal updates. That delay in communication would soon become part of the growing confusion. Back at the original hospital, the staff shift had just settled into the evening rhythm when the urgency escalated. A second alert arrived, confirming that the patient's condition was becoming more unstable. The medical team at the receiving facility was struggling to maintain control using standard procedures. Time was becoming a critical factor, and hesitation was no longer an option. Senior staff members began reviewing possible solutions. Different names were suggested, different specialists considered, but each option came with limitations. Some were too far away. Others were already engaged in separate emergencies. The situation required someone immediately available and familiar with fast response stabilization under pressure. Slowly, the same conclusion kept appearing in the discussion again and again. The nurse who had been dismissed earlier that day was still the most suitable person for the case. For a moment, there was silence in the coordination room as this realization settled. The contradiction was obvious. On one hand, she had been officially removed from duty. On the other hand, she was now being recognized as the most qualified person for a critical emergency that was unfolding in real time. The urgency of the situation began to outweigh administrative clarity. A coordinator attempted to contact the hospital where she had been working, but the information received was incomplete. Different departments gave different answers. Some believed she had already left permanently. Others were unsure of the exact timing of her departure. There was no clear confirmation of her current location. This gap in communication created further delay. Meanwhile, the patient's condition continued to demand immediate attention. Medical staff at the receiving facility were doing everything they could, but they were also aware that certain interventions required more specialized experience than they currently had available on site. The pressure in the room increased as monitors continued to show unstable readings. Every minute mattered, and every delay added weight to the situation. Back at the hospital where she had worked, a few staff members who had interacted with her earlier in the day began to piece together what was happening. They remembered her calm handling of earlier cases, especially the breathing emergency that had briefly stabilized under her direction. That memory now felt more significant than it had at the time. Some began to question whether the earlier decision regarding her dismissal had been made too quickly. However, internal procedures still needed to be followed. Attempts were made to locate her contact information, but even that process was not smooth. Her details were not immediately accessible due to administrative updates that had not yet been finalized in the system. The delay, though small in normal circumstances, now became critical. As confusion continued between departments, the situation at the receiving facility reached a more serious point. The medical team there requested urgent external support. This request was not made lightly. It meant that internal resources were no longer sufficient, and additional specialized assistance needed to be brought in immediately. The request moved quickly up the chain of command. Within a short time, higher authorities within the Regional Medical Coordination Network became involved. They reviewed the case summaries, the patient condition, and the available staff list. Once again, the same name appeared as the most relevant option. The contradiction was now impossible to ignore. She was both unavailable on paper and urgently needed in practice. Efforts were made to trace her directly. Messages were sent through multiple channels. Calls were placed to known contact points. However, she had already left the hospital and was walking home, unaware of the rapidly unfolding situation. Her phone was not immediately reachable, either due to timing or missed connection. Each failed attempt increased the urgency of the situation. At the same time, coordination between the two facilities became more intense. Medical teams exchanged updates rapidly, trying to stabilize the patient while also searching for a solution. There was a growing sense that time was slipping away faster than expected. The earlier confidence in managing the situation had now shifted into careful concern. A senior coordinator finally made a decision to escalate the matter further. If the required specialist could not be reached through normal communication channels, then emergency retrieval procedures might need to be considered. This was not a standard step, and it was only used when all other options had been exhausted or when the risk level demanded immediate action. The idea of sending rapid transport support was discussed quietly at first. It was not yet finalized, but the possibility was no longer being dismissed. The situation had reached a point where location became just as important as skill. Finding the right person quickly was now the priority. Unbeknownst to her, while she continued walking through the evening streets with her thoughts still heavy from earlier events, her name was being spoken in urgent conversations across multiple medical teams. She was no longer just a former staff member who had left her shift. She was now the central focus of a developing emergency response that was growing more serious by the minute. At the same time, no one yet knew how to reach her in time. The distance between her quiet walk home and the escalating urgency in the medical network felt enormous, even though it was measured only in minutes of time. One side of the system was still trying to understand what had gone wrong earlier in the day, while the other side was racing to solve a life-threatening situation that required her exact expertise. And as the evening deepened further, the growing urgency continued to build, setting the stage for a response that would soon move far beyond phone calls and internal messages, into something far more immediate and unexpected. The evening sky had already started to deepen into a soft gray blue when the situation reached its breaking point. Inside the coordination center, the tension was no longer quiet. It had grown into something active, something that moved from one decision to another without pause. Screens were updated constantly, phone calls overlapped, and voices rose and fell in controlled urgency. The patient's condition had worsened again. Despite efforts from the receiving medical team, stability could not be fully maintained. Each intervention helped for a short time, but the underlying problem continued to resist treatment. The medical staff on site were experienced, but they were also aware of their limits. This was not a case where general knowledge was enough. It required someone who had handled exactly this kind of sudden collapse under pressure, with fast decision-making in unpredictable conditions. That realization kept returning in every discussion. And with each passing minute, the same name came up again. The nurse who had left her shift earlier that day. At first, some hesitation remained in officially moving forward with emergency retrieval measures. There were still administrative questions, still uncertainty about her exact status. But those concerns slowly became secondary as the patient's condition continued to demand immediate action. The medical reality in front of them was more urgent than paperwork or internal confirmations. A senior coordinator finally made a firm decision. The priority was no longer internal procedure. The priority was locating the most capable person available, regardless of recent administrative changes. Once that decision was made, things moved quickly. 2 medical response helicopters were prepared. They were not deployed lightly. Their use meant the situation had reached a level where ground transport would take too long. The distance, traffic conditions, and time required for road transport were no longer acceptable risks. Air retrieval was now the fastest way to reach the target location and bring the specialist back if found. Meanwhile, efforts to contact her directly continued. Multiple calls were placed again. Messages were sent through hospital records. Even personal emergency contact channels were checked. But there was still no immediate response. Her phone remained unreachable at that moment, and each failed attempt added another layer of urgency to the situation. At the same time, another team was sent to trace her possible route home. Based on her usual habits and the time she had left the hospital, they estimated the general direction she might have taken. It was not exact, but it was enough to begin a search pattern. The helicopters were instructed to scan the surrounding areas visually once airborne. Within minutes, the first helicopter lifted off. The sound of the rotors filled the air as it rose above the hospital grounds, followed shortly by the second. Inside each aircraft, medical coordination staff and pilots communicated constantly with the ground team. The plan was simple in theory but difficult in execution. Locate her as quickly as possible and establish direct contact. From above, the city appeared different. Streets that felt long on foot now looked like narrow lines of light and shadow. Buildings formed quiet clusters, and moving vehicles created slow streams of motion. The search area was divided into sections to avoid confusion. Each helicopter covered a separate zone, slowly moving in overlapping paths. On the ground, updates continued to arrive. The patient's condition remained unstable. There were moments of slight improvement, but they did not hold. Medical staff were doing everything possible to maintain control, but the underlying issue required a specific intervention strategy that was time-sensitive. The longer it took to bring in the right specialist, the higher the risk became. Inside the coordination center, conversations became sharper. One of the senior doctors reviewed the earlier case reports again. The nurse's actions from the morning were studied in more detail. Her decisions were not random. They followed a pattern of careful observation and timely intervention. Even those who had questioned her earlier began to recognize that her approach had been consistent with effective emergency response principles. There was growing agreement on one point. If she could be reached in time, she might be the only person who could stabilize the situation properly. But time was no longer moving in their favor. At that moment, she was still walking home. She had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. The weight of the earlier dismissal was still on her mind, but it was slowly settling into quiet confusion rather than active distress. She walked at a steady pace, holding her bag close, occasionally looking at the ground as she thought about the day. The streets around her were calm. People were returning home, small shops were closing, and the noise of daytime activity was fading. She passed familiar corners without stopping, not rushing, but not lingering either. Her thoughts were still trying to make sense of what had happened earlier. The decision felt sudden, unclear, and unresolved in her mind. Above her, far beyond what she could see, the search had already begun. The first helicopter scanned wide sections of residential blocks, while the second focused on connecting roads and pedestrian routes. The pilots followed instructions from the coordination center, adjusting altitude slightly to improve visibility. Searchlights were used in targeted areas where movement was more likely. Inside the aircraft, communication was constant. Updates came in about the patient's condition, the urgency level, and the increasing need for immediate intervention. The crew also received descriptions of the nurse's appearance and last known location. Though the information was limited, it was enough to begin narrowing down possibilities. Still, the search was not easy. From above, many people looked similar in size and movement. The evening lighting made identification difficult. Trees, buildings, and streetlights created shadows that shifted as the helicopters moved. The search pattern had to be repeated several times over different sections. Minutes passed, then more minutes. On the ground, she continued walking without realizing that two aircraft were actively scanning the area above her. She adjusted her pace slightly as she approached a wider road, pausing briefly at an intersection. Her mind was still occupied with thoughts of the hospital, trying to understand if she had missed something important, or if there was some explanation she had not been given. It was in that moment that the coordination center received a new update. A potential visual match had been spotted. One of the helicopter crews reported a figure matching the general description walking along a moderately lit road not far from the hospital district. The movement pattern, clothing, and timing aligned with the estimated route. It was not confirmed yet, but it was close enough to investigate further. The second helicopter adjusted its path immediately to support verification. On the ground, the medical coordination team increased communication frequency. If the visual match was correct, they needed to establish contact immediately. Every second mattered now. The patient's condition was no longer simply unstable. It was approaching a critical threshold. The helicopter lowered slightly, maintaining safe altitude while improving visibility. A searchlight slowly swept across the road below, and there she was, walking alone, unaware of the attention now focused on her from above. The crew confirmed the visual match through quick comparison with available images. The coordination center was notified immediately. Instructions were given to prepare for direct contact. A speaker system was activated inside the helicopter, ready to call down to her. But for a brief moment, there was hesitation. Not because of doubt about her identity, but because of the suddenness of it all. From her perspective below, the sound of helicopters overhead would feel unusual, even alarming. The crew needed to ensure they did not cause panic or confusion. The helicopter maintained position, circling slightly above her route. Inside the coordination center, the final decision was made. She needed to be contacted immediately. No further delay was acceptable. And as the helicopter prepared to make direct contact, she continued walking forward, still unaware that the next moment would change the direction of her entire day in a way she could not yet imagine. She was still walking forward slowly, lost in her thoughts, when the sound above her began to change. At first, it was just a distant hum, something she almost ignored because the city had many sounds at night. But then it grew louder, more focused, and impossible to dismiss. She lifted her head slightly and noticed the movement of light across the buildings around her. A strong beam swept over the street ahead, followed by the unmistakable sound of rotor blades cutting through the air. Her steps slowed. For a moment, she simply stood there, looking up, unsure of what she was seeing. Two helicopters were circling above the area, moving in controlled patterns. It was not something that happened in ordinary situations, especially not in a quiet residential road at that hour. People nearby also began to notice. Some stopped walking. Others stepped closer to walls or streetlights, trying to understand what was happening. She felt a strange mix of confusion and unease. Her first thought was that something serious must be happening nearby. Accidents, emergencies, or medical evacuations sometimes required air support. but she could not understand why it seemed so close to her position. She tightened her grip on her bag slightly and took a small step back toward the sidewalk, watching the helicopters carefully. Then a voice came. It was faint at first, coming through a loudspeaker mounted on one of the aircraft. The sound echoed through the street, slightly distorted by the wind and rotor noise. It repeated again, clearer this time, calling out for her. Her body went still. She did not immediately understand that the message was directed at her. Her mind tried to process it logically, thinking there must be someone else nearby. But then the helicopter adjusted its position, lowering slightly and aligning directly above her section of the road. A bright light focused gently on her area, making it clear that she was the point of attention. The voice came again, more precise now, requesting her to stop and remain where she was. A few people nearby began to step aside, creating space without fully understanding the situation. She slowly turned her head, looking around as if trying to confirm that this was really happening. Her expression showed confusion first, then growing concern. She had never experienced anything like this in her life. Within moments, the second helicopter arrived in closer range, confirming her location. Communication between the aircraft and the coordination center became immediate and continuous. The confirmation was sent. The target had been found. Back at the coordination center, the atmosphere shifted quickly. The moment she was identified, urgency reached its peak. The medical team immediately prepared instructions for direct communication. The patient's condition was still critical, and every second mattered. There was no longer time for delay or confusion. The priority now was to bring her into the medical response chain as fast as possible. On the street, she finally responded to the voice through the loudspeaker. She raised her hand slightly, signaling that she was hearing them but not fully understanding. Her voice did not reach them clearly over the noise, so she simply stood still and waited. The helicopter adjusted again, lowering the volume of its movement slightly while maintaining safe distance. A message was relayed more clearly this time. She was being requested for immediate medical assistance at an emergency facility. For a moment, she did not move. The words felt distant, almost unreal. Only hours ago, she had been told she was no longer needed at her workplace. Now she was being called back through helicopters for an emergency she had no knowledge of. Her mind struggled to connect the two realities. She asked a simple question upward, her voice uncertain. What had happened? The response came quickly through coordination channels, though it was still partially filtered through the loudspeaker system. A patient in critical condition required her immediate expertise. Her specific skills and earlier actions that day had led to her being identified as the most suitable person for the case. She stood quietly for a few seconds. The weight of the situation began to settle in slowly. It was not just confusion anymore. It was something deeper. A sense that something significant was unfolding beyond her control or expectation. She had left the hospital believing her day was over. Now she was being asked to return in the most urgent way possible. From above, the coordination team waited for her response. Time was still critical. The patient's condition had not improved, and transport preparations were already in motion. The helicopters were ready to assist her movement if she agreed. Medical protocol required her consent before proceeding further. She finally spoke again, this time more clearly. She asked if the patient was stable. The answer she received was brief but honest. The situation was serious and required immediate intervention. There was no attempt to hide the urgency. That honesty seemed to shift something in her expression. She closed her eyes briefly, as if processing everything at once. Then she nodded. It was a small movement, but it carried clear meaning. She agreed. Immediately, the coordination center responded. Instructions were given to prepare for safe transport. The helicopter above adjusted position, preparing for descent assistance. A ground support team was redirected to her location. Everything began moving quickly now with synchronized urgency. A few minutes later, a secure landing zone nearby was identified. She was guided calmly by the crew through loudspeaker instructions to move toward a safer area. Her steps were still slightly uncertain, but she followed carefully. People around her watched in silence, unsure of what exactly was happening, but aware that it was something serious. As she moved, she looked once more toward the hospital direction in the distance. Her thoughts briefly returned to earlier that day. The dismissal, the silence in the office, the feeling of walking away without understanding. It all felt disconnected from the present moment. Yet somehow it was all part of the same unfolding chain of events. A ground support vehicle arrived first, followed by medical coordination staff. They approached her quickly but respectfully, confirming her identity and preparing her for immediate transfer. She was given a brief explanation of the situation again, this time more structured and direct. There was no time for long discussion. She stepped into the prepared transport area. As she was guided toward the helicopter, she looked up again at the aircraft that had been circling above her just minutes earlier. The same machines that had once felt confusing now felt like part of something urgent and important. She still did not know all the details, but she understood enough to know that someone's life depended on what would happen next. Inside the helicopter, she was seated securely. Communication headsets were provided so she could stay connected with the medical team during transport. As soon as she was ready, the aircraft lifted again into the night sky. Below her, the city lights slowly shifted into patterns as they gained altitude. The coordination center continued updating her on the patient's condition. Every detail was shared in simple terms, allowing her to understand what awaited her. She listened carefully, her expression becoming more focused with each passing second. The confusion from earlier in the evening had now been replaced with professional clarity. She was no longer someone walking home after an unexpected dismissal. She was now part of a critical response effort that required her full attention. As the helicopter moved forward through the night, she prepared herself mentally for what she would face upon arrival. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, steady again, as if her earlier uncertainty had been replaced by something more familiar. The sense of responsibility returned, not forced but natural to her. And far below, the city continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that one nurse's path had just shifted from an ordinary walk home into the center of an urgent medical mission that was still unfolding with every passing second.